Welcome to Neon Cobra. Let's kick into it. Excellent. So this week we're going to talk about the execution phase when we're entering Azure-based projects. This is really where the rubber meets the road. So we're going to talk about a little bit about the stuff we reviewed in the planning phase and kind of how it comes to fruition. And we're going to talk about some certain items that you're going to run across. Now, this may be one of the longer videos. I'm going to try to keep it fairly high level, but there is going to be some technical aspects. Most of this is going to be really about people management, though, because that's really the crux of project management in the end. So first things first, we're kicking off the project. We've spent all this time in the planning phase. You need to distribute your high-level timelines to the stakeholders and the champions you identified in the planning phase, right? They need to know what's coming. Specifically, you need to highlight your high-risk windows or downtimes, times when you'll be doing maybe large data transfers that could be thrashing the disks, times your go live or your cutover dates, your user access testing, which we'll talk about in a bit. Understanding these timelines and preparing the client is important, because the last thing you want is maybe a stakeholder or a champion being like, yeah, totally, we can do it on Monday, to find out it's their end of month or end of year and accounting's down your throat because you've shut the entire system down and you're working through some issues. So having that communication, and again, really leaning on your champion to facilitate and provide you the information is key for this. Now, there's a general saying, and we'll talk about this on the go live window section. Client should expect a few bumpy days. You should be under promising and over delivering on your project. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean do a poor job, but don't promise them there won't be any issues, because even the best laid plans can always run into little bumps. The next thing that always tends to catch, at least myself and a lot of organizations, is DNS. It's always going to be in DNS. And there's a reason why that's a common saying in the industry. When we're moving our on-prem infrastructure, like our domain controllers and such, we're removing the DNS and the DHCP server from the local environment. Now, you may retire out the settings, you may, demote that, but you might still have that acting as your relay point. You've got static IP, reservations, all this stuff built in. And if you're not paying attention and you just power off the domain controller, the whole environment goes down. Azure DNS and networking functions a little bit differently, right? Where we would normally kind of statically assign the IP addresses within the operating system itself, you would actually do that on the virtual network cards or the VNets in Azure. Your DNS is also generally referenced on a subnet or a VNet level. So you need to ensure that all these new kind of changes and redirects are done appropriately. You also need something to handle the on-prem DNS and routing, right? Because once you remove all the hardware on-prem and you shut it down, you need to make sure they can still get IP addresses and see what they need to see. Additionally, a lot of organizations may be coming from a .local domain, which when you move into Azure, leveraging things like Entra ID Connect, formerly AD Connect, is required for virtual desktoping. So in order to be able to connect that environment, you need to add a routable domain of some form so you can connect it into Office 365. And what tends to happen, and is often overlooked, and will probably be the first ticket you get post-project, is, hey, our website is down. Because they might go to, neoncobra.cloud, and that's now my routable domain, but internally it's trying to route me to the local DC. Now, this is not a new Azure problem, but it's just something I've run into a lot of times. And usually because we have to go from a .local to a routable domain, it's more prominent when we're moving to Azure. So you just need to create a CNAME record, tell the clients, use www. And then it'll go to the website accordingly. The next thing, printers, right? Any project you're looking at, printers are always the issue, right? Even when there's no project, printers are probably always the issue. You need to find a solution for that. When you're moving into Azure, if you're severing a VPN tunnel, the idea is to be completely cloud and ABD, you've now kind of cut your connection to the localized printers, especially if there was an active print server in play with numerous queues and GPOs. So you really have a couple of options on this one. One would be maintaining a VPN tunnel, which can be a little costly and unnecessary, and something you got to maintain to provide a line of sight, and then you manage it with a traditional, print server. The second is just to do USB redirect or pass through into virtual desktoping, which is completely fine. A little bit more of a manual modifying, and really when you start to get down to custom queues like print, color queues, stapling, collating, it becomes a little bit harder because they have to they're treating it like a USB device. So you can't set up these predefined profiles. Really, like SaaS-based print products like Printix is something that we carry at PAX 8 as an example. That one's, very good for these solutions. They tend to be very cost effective. They take a lot of the burden away from it, and you can actually use it to completely replicate and rebuild off of the existing infrastructure with very little kind of required work. So it's always something just to consider. Next, profiles, right? Especially if we're moving them up into Azure, or we're disconnecting everyone from the local domain and joining them to Entra ID for that kind of seamless identity experience. Your major items, obviously your desktop, your documents, your pictures, which OneDrive will pick up, but often overlooked is the user app data, right? I found a lot of times organizations weren't doing like the Chrome syncing. So all their bookmarks and passwords and all the stuff that they rely upon, because maybe they haven't quite signed up for your password manager yet, is living in that app data folder. So you'd have to copy every one of those over. And now, while they aren't that big as far as quantity and size, quantity is massive. A Google Chrome app data folder can be up in the tens to 100,000 of items. And that just takes time to process. So when you're disconnecting domains and reconnecting, you need to make sure, you have access and you can get to this data. Conversely, if you're using folder redirection, right, and your profile redirection rather, and your profiles are living on the server, you need to make sure they're syncing correctly. Offline files and folders, while great in concept, if it runs into an issue and it can't sync things properly, when you disconnect them from the domain, you could lose data. And you really just have to pray you can pull it from a cache file that lives on the local system. So if you're going to be doing these jumps and offline folders and files are being used, ensure that you're checking that the last sync was successful and there's no pending errors. So we've gotten our printers, we've gotten our profiles. One of the things you would do, and you're going to revisit this in the audit section we'll talk about, is review external access, right? We've got just tech debt, we'll call it. We've got years of maybe vendors coming in, previous ISPs, MSPs, whatever the case, coming into the environment and requesting this port or requesting that port. Maybe there was a web server. Maybe you were doing RDP at one point. You want to validate your ports and external access and accounts in the environment before you move that up into Azure, especially if you're doing a straight migration, because what you're going to find a lot of times is what might have been okay on premise, and I use that term loosely because it really isn't okay, but when you move these items into Azure, Azure is a commonly scanned IP range. So while it's just a matter of time before you hit on premise with these vulnerabilities and issues, because a scanner is a scanner, you're likely to accelerate that when you move into Azure. Now, that is definitely not to be a deterrent to move to Azure. You have way more tools likely available to you to prevent this, but just check your baselines, right? 3389 shouldn't be open. You shouldn't be exposing, port 22, anything like that to the port, to the internet just blindly. You need to understand what you're exposing and really kind of lock things down. Global admin accounts, any sort of elevated permissions, like why do they have local admin? Is there a way you can get around that? Maybe you adopt a PIM methodology, right? Take your time to look at this, because once you're starting to move things in the cloud, you really should be modernizing as you go. It's not just a hardware lift. So we've got everything up. It's there. What's your next step? User access testing. You need your champion to choose select people in that organization that you can trust to test. If no one's testing things correctly and it goes live and none of it works, you now have problems on your hands. It's very, very hard and detrimental to roll back. But you do need to maybe have a ripcord out. If there is a massive issue, you need to be able to back off, figure out what it is, and maybe replan and redeploy. You as the project manager and the team has to decide where that no return point is, and you need to really be planning for that. And user access testing is one of the best ways to get through to that. Have them run their cycles. What's their day-to-day? Can they access their emails? Can their line of business apps run? Now, obviously, this is going to be doing load testing. It's really going to be testing more of, do our apps work correctly? And then what that leaves you with is triaging later when you have to deal with, there's a performance issue. Okay, maybe some more resources. You deal with that. Now, as far as your go live date, right? As you near this project cutover date, you need to reaffirm with the client and everybody there that you need patience as a large scale move is occurring, right? Make sure they're not planning massive orders first thing Monday morning. Have your team ready on site and have communication ready to go so they understand that this is a large impacting project. You've planned for the worst, but you're ready to address it and move forward. So patience is going to be key. Now, your champion is going to be absolutely crucial in this one. They need to be on the ball, because what's going to happen as your technicians are running around putting out fires is people are going to be pulling them into offices. I've got this problem. I got that problem. Your champion is going to be there to prioritize the fires, because just because someone can scream really, really loud about how their printer doesn't work doesn't mean they have any real impact to the business. So you need to be documenting, capturing, sending that to your champion and asking what's more important. Because maybe the accounting is important. Maybe they're cutting checks for everybody. So you need that champion to be able to prioritize the business level fires. Now, one thing you have to be doing is capturing and documenting the issues, right? And you need to be actively putting those into your project ticketing system, not as a service request, but as an issue ticket. Because the idea is you're going to be going through and iteratively hammering these out, prioritizing and shuffling, assigning, but you want to see the scope of work that was done at the end. And we'll talk about more in the auditing and closing phase over the next couple of weeks. But capturing that information is going to be crucial to the overall success of your project and future projects. And finally, as we sort of edge in or ease into the closing phase, we need to set goalposts. One of the biggest problems that we always ran into with our projects that we were able to address was project sprawl, right? You just can't close that project. It keeps going. It keeps going. There's always a ticket. There's always a thing. So what you do is as you get past your go live window and you've more or less stamped things out, you set a goalpost. You have 1 week, Mr. or Mrs. Client, to report any other issues with the environment before it leaves the project team and goes into regular support queues. Now, that might be the same teams depending on the size of your organization, but there's a very distinct reason for this, because what ends up happening is you start to get a poor representation of how much labor a project actually costs. And they tend to get accelerated support when it's in project phase. So they might just start throwing regular tickets into your project queue because they know you're going to answer. You're checking emails, you're checking the projects. So the idea by setting this goalpost is it really forces the client to look inward of like, okay, is everything okay? Are we ready for this? By doing that, you can essentially identify all the issues by the end of the week. Friday at 4 o'clock, you say any final issues to document. They say no. That's completely fine. You capture everything in your project tickets. You let them know as of Monday, any future problems that are outside of these ones identified, those need to go into support. And then you spend the next week or whatever it takes to hammer out those lingering issues. That gives you an exit ramp. That gives you the ability to finish the project, get a signature, and put it back into support, right? It's all about managing the numbers and the buckets it's pulling from a lot of time. It also allows you to set a better expectation for that CSAT score on the way out. When you're clear with your expectations and you're firm but understanding on your project, it really allows them to encapsulate at the end, how was the project? Communication was amazing. Even though we had a couple little problems, we were well prepared for that. We managed it through, and it was probably the most smoothest project we've ever been in. Now, what you'll find a lot of times in IT, depending on how experienced or how seasoned they are with projects, sometimes the client has, almost fear of upcoming project because the previous project took them down for weeks, right? I hear this story all the time. And a lot of that has to do with lack of planning, lack of communication, right? Maybe there was no user access testing. So these are very, very important. So what happens in this phase, it's kind of a rolling ball, if you will. You start with your scoping, you've planned out. Execution is heavily about communication, status updates, what things are looking like, making sure things are, even though there might be a fire, you're communicating on a regular interval and you're living up to your name. And you can be the worst project deployment you've ever done, but if you're keeping the client and the stakeholders informed of progress, informed of issues you're running into and how you're working through it, there'll be more understanding at the end. This is from personal experience. This is even how I receive, if I take my car in for an oil change and it turns into a brake and it turns into this, just having this communicated of I went through here and this is what we found, lessens the blow. So execution phase, probably one of the most important as far as executing for the client, but probably the most important for an MSP is going to be the planning phase, which is the previous video. We got 2 more. We've got our auditing and closing coming up over the next coming weeks. Often overlooked, but very, very important. So stay tuned and we'll talk to you then. Take care.